The air conditioning in the Charleston Historical Society's archive room had been broken for 3 days, and Dr. Sarah Chen could feel sweat trickling down her spine as she worked through boxes of 19th century documents. August in South Carolina was oppressive, but trapped in a windowless basement surrounded by aging paper and leather, the heat felt almost malevolent. She had spent 3 years cataloguing the Society's photographic archives, watching Charleston's past emerge from yellowed envelopes and crumbling boxes. Most days the work was routine, even tedious. Today would be different. The photograph was tucked between property ledgers from 1895, its edges brown and brittle. Sarah almost missed it. Would have if one corner hadn't caught the light in a way that made her pause. She set down her cold coffee and carefully extracted the image. It showed 5 young men on a plantation porch, bodies rigid in the formal poses required by long exposure times. They wore dark suits despite the heat, their expressions frozen in the solemn countenance of that era. The plantation house behind them was grand but showing age, paint peeling from columns, boards on the porch visibly warped. Magnolia trees framed the composition, glossy leaves catching light. The 5 young men stood in order of height, tallest left to shortest right. The notation on the back in faded brown ink read, "The Hartley Brothers, Summer 1895, Magnolia Grove Plantation." Sarah turned the photograph over slowly, feeling the weight of history in that fragile piece of paper. She had examined hundreds of similar family portraits during her years at the Society. Wealthy Charleston families documenting their lineages, their properties, their positions in post-Civil War society. This should have been just another image to catalogue, just another photograph. She almost moved on, almost, but something made her look closer, and when she did, her coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed, ceramic scattering, coffee spreading. Sarah barely noticed. She was staring at the photograph, hands beginning to tremble, breath coming faster. Among the 5 brothers stood a 6th figure. The figure was positioned between the 2nd and 3rd young men, slightly behind but clearly part of the group. This person wore the same dark suit, stood at the same height, cast a distinct shadow on the porch boards. Everything about the posture suggested they belonged there. But where a face should have been, where eyes and nose and mouth should have been visible, there was only an oval void of darkness, as if someone had taken acid or heat and deliberately burned away the emulsion, erasing this person while leaving everything else perfectly preserved. Sarah's heart hammered. In 3 years of work with historical photographs, she had seen deterioration of every kind, images faded to invisibility, chemical reactions turning faces green or purple, water damage, mold, improper storage effects, but never anything like this. The destruction was too precise. The rest of the photograph was in remarkable condition. Every other face was clear, every detail sharp. Buttons on suits visible, grain of wood planks distinct, individual magnolia leaves countable. Everything preserved with startling clarity, except this one oval of darkness where a face should be. Marcus Washington appeared in the doorway. Tall in his 50s, with grey threading through his hair, he had the patient demeanour of someone who'd spent decades dealing with Charleston's complicated racial history. He took in the scene, broken cup, Sarah's pale face, her trembling hands. "You okay? I heard something break." Sarah couldn't speak. She held out the photograph. Marcus crossed the room carefully, avoiding spilled coffee and ceramic, and took the image. His expression changed as he saw what she'd seen. His eyebrows drew together, mouth tightening. "Jesus," he breathed. "What am I looking at?" "I don't know," Sarah managed. "I thought you could tell me." Marcus moved closer to the overhead light, tilting the photograph to examine it from multiple angles, his experienced eyes searching for any rational explanation. "This isn't normal deterioration," he said slowly, his tone thoughtful and troubled. "Look at how precise it is, Perfect oval shape, clean edges, everything around it is crystal clear. This was done deliberately. Someone wanted this person's face completely erased from this photograph. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, despite the stifling heat. But why keep the photograph at all? Why not just destroy it completely if you wanted to erase someone? That, Marcus said quietly, still staring at the faceless void, is an excellent and deeply troubling question. Lee, they spent the next hour examining the photograph with every tool available in the archive's modest conservation laboratory. Under magnification, the damaged area showed clear signs of deliberate chemical treatment. The emulsion hadn't faded or flaked away naturally. It had been systematically dissolved in that specific oval area, and only that area. Under UV light, the destruction became even more apparent, the damaged section appearing as a perfect black hole against the fluorescent glow of the preserved portions. Sarah photographed the image from every conceivable angle, adjusting lighting and exposure settings, trying to coax any hidden details from that void of darkness. Nothing emerged. Whoever had erased this face had done so thoroughly and with clear intention. "We need to find out who these people were," Sarah said finally, carefully returning the original photograph to an archival sleeve. "The Hartley family, Magnolia Grove Plantation, summer 1895. That's our starting point." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll start pulling property records. You check the census data and newspaper archives. If something significant happened with this family, there might be documentation." Sarah moved to her computer workstation, her hands still trembling slightly as she logged into the historical database systems. She started with the federal census records, searching for Charleston County, 1895. The search results appeared quickly. Hartley, Jacob, age 47. Occupation, physician, head of household, property value, substantial. She scrolled down through the household listing. Hartley, Ruth, age 43, wife. Then the children, listed in descending age order. Thomas Hartley, age 22. William Hartley, age 20. James Hartley, age 18, Robert Hartley, age 16, Daniel Hartley, age 14, 5 sons, 5 brothers. The census listed exactly 5 male children. Sarah stared at the screen, a cold sensation settling in her stomach. The caption on the photograph clearly stated, "The Hartley brothers." 5 young men were visible with recognizable faces. But the 6th figure, the one whose face had been so deliberately erased, wasn't listed in the census at all. No 6th brother, no adopted children, no wards or extended family members or lodgers listed at the Magnolia Grove address. "Marcus," she called out, her voice tight with tension. "Come look at this." He came over immediately, reading the census data over her shoulder. 5 brothers in the census, but 6 people in the photograph. Exactly. So who is the 6th person? And why did someone want them erased? Maybe they weren't family, Marcus suggested thoughtfully. Could have been a servant, a tutor, a friend, someone who was there when the photograph was taken, but wasn't technically part of the family. Then why are they positioned right in the middle of the brothers like they belong there? Sarah zoomed in on the digital scan she'd made. Look at the body language. The 2nd brother, this one here, has his hand resting on the faceless figure's shoulder. It's casual, familiar. These people knew each other well. This wasn't some random person who wandered into the frame. She began searching through digitized newspaper archives, looking for any mention of the Hartley family in Charleston papers from 1895 and the years immediately following. For a prominent family with a substantial plantation, there should have been social notices, business announcements, perhaps mentions of charitable activities or civic involvement. She found scattered references. An announcement of a church fundraiser hosted at Magnolia Grove in March 1895. A brief notice about cotton prices mentioning Jacob Hartley's plantation as a local supplier. a social item about the Hartley family attending a Charleston cultural event. Then she found something that made her breath catch in her throat. A small notice in the Charleston Mercury, dated October 15th, 1895, tucked away on page 7 between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of ship arrivals. Daniel Hartley, age 14, son of prominent physician Dr. Jacob Hartley of Magnolia Grove Plantation, reported missing by his family. Young Master Hartley was last seen on the plantation grounds on the evening of October 12th. He is described as of slight build, fair complexion, brown hair. The family requests anyone with information regarding Daniel's whereabouts to contact the Charleston Police Department immediately. A substantial reward is offered for information leading to the boy's safe return. Sarah's hands were trembling again as she printed the article. October 1895. Just a few months after that summer photograph had been taken, the youngest Hartley brother had vanished without a trace. She searched desperately for follow-up articles, scanning through weeks and then months of newspaper archives. There had to be more information, some resolution to the story, but she found nothing substantial. A few brief mentions in the following weeks, noting that the search continued, that the family remained hopeful. Then silence. Daniel Hartley had simply disappeared from the historical record, as if he had never existed at all. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice barely steady. "The youngest brother, Daniel. He went missing in October 1895, just a few months after this photograph was taken, and as far as I can tell, he was never found." Marcus came over and read the newspaper notice she'd found. His expression grew increasingly grave. A 14-year-old boy disappears from a prominent family's plantation, and there's barely any coverage. That's strange. You'd expect extensive searching, rewards posted, ongoing news coverage, especially for a wealthy, well-connected family like the Hartleys. Unless, Sarah said slowly, a terrible suspicion forming in her mind, unless the family didn't want extensive coverage. Unless they had reasons to keep the whole thing quiet. She turned back to her computer and began searching for information about the other Hartley brothers, tracking what had happened to them in the years after 1895. What she found sent chills down her spine. Thomas Hartley, the eldest brother, died in 1897 at age 24. The death certificate listed the cause as drowning in the Ashley River. But a brief newspaper article about the incident described the circumstances as suspicious, noting that Thomas had been an excellent swimmer and that witnesses reported seeing signs of a struggle on the riverbank where his body was later recovered. William Hartley, the second eldest, was committed to the State Hospital for the Insane in Columbia in 1899 when he was just 26 years old. The commitment papers, which Sarah found in state institutional records, indicated that he had experienced a complete mental collapse and had become violently agitated, claiming to see faces that weren't there, speaking of terrible crimes, unable to sleep or eat. He died in the asylum 3 years later, in 1902. The death certificate listed the cause as general paralysis of the insane, a diagnostic term often used in that era to describe the final stages of untreated syphilis, severe schizophrenia, or the cumulative effects of the brutal treatments common in 19th-century mental institutions. James Hartley, the middle brother, left Charleston abruptly in 1900, moving to Baltimore where he worked as a clerk in a shipping company. He lived alone in a series of modest boarding houses, never married, maintained no close relationships that appeared in any records. He died in 1910 at the age of 33. The death certificate listed acute alcohol poisoning as the cause. Robert Hartley, the second youngest, also left Charleston in 1900, relocating to St. Louis, where he found work as a bookkeeper. Like his brother James, he never married, lived alone, and seemed to avoid forming any lasting connections. His trail went cold in the St. Louis city records around 1915. No death certificate was ever filed in Missouri or any other state that Sarah could locate. Robert Hartley had simply vanished from documented existence. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. 5 brothers photographed together in the summer of 1895. Within 20 years, all 5 were dead or missing, their lives marked by violence, madness, addiction, and isolation. It was a pattern of destruction that went far beyond normal family tragedy. "Something happened to this family," she said to Marcus, spreading out all the documents and printouts she'd gathered. "Something terrible. Look at this pattern. Daniel disappears at age 14. Thomas drowns under suspicious circumstances 2 years later. William goes insane and dies in an asylum. James becomes an alcoholic and dies alone. Robert disappears completely. None of them married. None had children. They all died young or vanished. It's like the entire family line was systematically destroyed." Marcus studied the timeline she'd created, and in the middle of all this destruction, someone deliberately erases a face from the only surviving family photograph. What were they trying to hide, Sarah? Who was the faceless person? That night, Sarah couldn't sleep at all. She lay in her humid bedroom, ceiling fan rotating slowly overhead, mind churning through possibilities and connections. She kept seeing that oval void where a face should have been, kept thinking about Daniel Hartley's terrified expression in the photograph, about 4 boys who had disappeared from the area around Magnolia Grove in the fall of 1895, about the systematic destruction of an entire family line. At 2:30 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely. She dressed quietly, drove through Charleston's empty streets to the Historical Society, and used her key to enter the silent, darkened building. Her desk lamp created a small circle of light in the vast darkness of the archive room. She took out the original photograph again, studying it with a powerful magnifying glass, examining every microscopic detail with exhaustive care. The faceless figure's hands were visible and relatively clear, she noticed with growing attention. Long, slender fingers with well-maintained nails. No wedding ring. One hand rested on what appeared to be the shoulder of the youngest brother, Daniel, in a gesture that could have been affectionate or controlling or both. The boy's expression, she saw now with complete clarity, wasn't merely solemn or serious. It was utterly terrified. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out visibly along his jawline. His eyes were slightly too wide with barely suppressed panic, and his entire posture was rigid in a way that communicated barely controlled fear rather than formal dignity. Looking more carefully at the other brothers' faces, Sarah could see similar signs of distress, subtler but definitely present. Thomas, the eldest, had a haunted look in his eyes, a tightness around his mouth. William's gaze was slightly unfocused, as if he was deliberately trying to look away from something. James appeared to be clenching his fist so hard that his knuckles showed white even in the faded photograph. Robert had the expression of someone trying desperately to maintain composure while something terrible happened just outside the camera's frame. These weren't the normal, solemn expressions of a formal 19th-century family photograph. These were the faces of young men experiencing genuine fear. Sarah pulled every file the Historical Society had on the Hartley family. Property records going back to the original land grant. Tax assessments showing the plantation's changing value over decades. Business records documenting cotton and rice production. Social registers listing the family's participation in Charleston society events. She read through everything methodically, searching for any clue, any anomaly, anything that might explain the photograph and the tragic fates of the brothers. In a folder of miscellaneous documents, she found a property survey from 1894, just a year before the photograph was taken. The detailed map showed the layout of Magnolia Grove Plantation, the main house, the slave quarters that had been converted to worker housing after the Civil War, various storage buildings, processing facilities for cotton and rice, stables, carriage houses. On the eastern edge of the property, isolated from the other structures, was a small building marked simply as medical facility. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Jacob Hartley had been a physician, according to the census. She knew that some plantation owners in the post-war period had provided basic medical care for their workers, partly from humanitarian concern, but often primarily to protect their labor force investment. But something about this notation troubled her. The building was marked as quite isolated from both the main house and the worker housing. Why would a medical facility be built so far from the people it was supposedly serving? She began searching for information about Jacob Hartley's medical career and background. She found his medical school records at the Medical College of South Carolina, showing that he'd graduated in 1869, in the chaotic years immediately after the Civil War. His academic performance had been mediocre at best, but he'd passed and received his medical degree. He'd worked at a Charleston hospital for several years before establishing his private practice. Then she found something that made her stomach clench with apprehension. In 1894, just a year before that photograph was taken and 2 years before Daniel's disappearance, there had been formal complaints filed against Dr. Jacob Hartley with the Medical College of South Carolina's Ethics Board. The complaints, filed by 3 different patients and their families, alleged that Hartley had conducted experimental treatments without informed consent, that he had caused unnecessary suffering to vulnerable patients, and that he had shown disturbing interest in the limits of human pain tolerance. The complaints had been officially investigated, but the investigation file was frustratingly sparse. Statements from the complainants describing treatments that sounded barbaric even by the standards of 19th century medicine. Hartley's response, dismissing the allegations as misunderstandings and attacks on his professional reputation by ignorant people who didn't understand modern medical science. Character references from other prominent Charleston physicians vouching for Hartley's skill and integrity. And finally, the board's decision, complaints dismissed due to insufficient evidence, but with a strongly worded recommendation that Dr. Hartley exercise greater care in explaining treatments to patients and obtaining clear consent. Shortly after this official rebuke, Hartley had abruptly resigned from the hospital where he practiced. He'd withdrawn from Charleston's medical community entirely, retreating to Magnolia Grove Plantation, where he established what the records described as a private practice focused on advancing medical knowledge through careful observation and documentation. Sarah's hands were shaking as she photocopied these documents. The pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. A doctor accused of experimental treatments without consent. A private facility built in isolation on his plantation property. 4 local boys who disappeared from the area in the fall of 1895, never to be seen again. And the youngest son of that doctor, also disappearing, also never found. She pulled up maps of Charleston County from 1895, identifying the families who lived in proximity to Magnolia Grove Plantation. Then she began searching for any other missing persons reports from that time period and area. What she found made her feel physically ill. Michael O'Brien, age 13, son of Irish immigrant tenant farmers working land adjacent to Magnolia Grove. Reported missing October 18, 1895, 6 days after Daniel Hartley vanished. Last seen walking toward the Hartley plantation, where his father had sent him to deliver a message about crop-sharing arrangements. Samuel Washington, age 15, one of the black workers' sons, living in the former slave quarters on Magnolia Grove itself. Reported missing November 2, 1895. Family members reported that the boy had been told to report to the medical facility for treatment of a minor injury sustained while working in the fields. He never returned. Robert Lee, no relation to the Confederate general, aged 12, son of a white sharecropping family on nearby property, reported missing November 15, 1895. Last seen accepting an offer from someone at Magnolia Grove to do odd jobs for good pay. Thomas Brooks, age 14, also from a black worker family on the plantation, reported missing December 3, 1895. His mother told police that Dr. Hartley had personally requested the boy assist in the medical facility with cleaning and organizing supplies. The boy never came home. James Patterson, age 13, son of white tenant farmers, reported missing December 20th, 1895, disappeared while returning from an errand to the Magnolia Grove property. William Hayes, age 16, another black worker's son, reported missing January 10th, 1896. His family reported that Dr. Hartley had specifically recruited him to participate in a paid medical study about youth physiology. Sarah sat surrounded by these missing persons reports as dawn light began filtering through the basement windows. 7 boys total, ranging in age from 12 to 16, all connected to Magnolia Grove Plantation, all disappeared within a 3-month period in late 1895 and early 1896, and for most of them, the last place they'd been seen was at or near Dr. Jacob Hartley's isolated medical facility. The newspaper coverage of these disappearances was shockingly minimal and varied dramatically based on the family's race and social status. Daniel Hartley's disappearance had received a prominent notice and mentions of substantial reward money. Michael O'Brien's disappearance had warranted a brief paragraph. The black boys' disappearances had received only the most cursory mentions, if they were covered at all, usually buried in the back pages near the classifieds. The investigations, such as they were, had apparently been perfunctory and produced no results. The boys had simply vanished, and the authorities had eventually stopped looking. Sarah called Marcus at 6 in the morning, waking him up. "I know what happened," she said without preamble. "I know what Hartley was doing. I'm going out to the old plantation site. I need to find that medical facility building." "Sarah, wait," Marcus said, his voice thick with sleep but sharpening with concern. "Don't go out there alone. Wait for me. Give me an hour to get ready." "I can't wait, Marcus. I need to see it now. I'll be careful. I'll keep my phone on." The drive out to what had been Magnolia Grove Plantation took about 40 minutes in early morning traffic. Most of the original plantation property had been subdivided decades ago, sold off piece by piece as Charleston expanded outward. The main house had burned to the ground in 1943 in a fire of suspicious origin that was never fully explained. Now the majority of the former plantation land was covered with suburban development, streets with names like Magnolia Court and Plantation Drive, lined with ranch houses built in the 1960s and 70s. Basketball hoops stood in driveways, children's toys littered carefully manicured lawns. It looked utterly normal, peaceful, quintessentially American suburban. But the eastern section of the property, where the isolated medical facility had supposedly stood, remained undeveloped. Sarah had researched why. The land had changed hands multiple times over the decades, with various development plans proposed and abandoned. Soil contamination issues had been cited in some planning documents, wetland protection concerns in others, local opposition to development based on historical preservation in still others. For whatever combination of reasons, this particular 20-acre parcel had never been built on, remaining a tangled wilderness of overgrown forest and crumbling ruins. Sarah parked on the shoulder where a barely visible dirt track disappeared into the trees. She grabbed her camera bag, a flashlight, and a crowbar from her car trunk. She'd learned from experience that old buildings often had rusted locks and stuck doors. The September heat was already building despite the early hour, and humidity hung thick in the air. Insects buzzed in aggressive clouds. The undergrowth was dense, thorny vines catching at her clothes as she pushed deeper into the woods. She used her phone's GPS, following the coordinates she'd calculated from the old property survey maps. After about 25 minutes of difficult hiking through increasingly thick vegetation, she found it. The building was substantially collapsed, its roof caved in on one side, walls sagging dangerously inward, but enough of the structure remained intact to clearly see its original form, a long, narrow building constructed of brick and wood, with a row of small windows set high in the walls. The windows had iron bars. Not decorative wrought iron, but plain, functional bars, clearly designed to prevent someone from getting out, or perhaps from anyone seeing in. Sarah approached carefully, testing each step. The building was at least 125 years old, and obviously unstable, but she had to see inside. She had to know. The main door had rotted away decades ago, leaving a gaping entrance into darkness. Sarah turned on her powerful flashlight and stepped cautiously inside, her heart pounding. The interior had been devastated by more than a century of exposure to the elements. The floor was littered with fallen timbers from the collapsed roof sections, with thick accumulations of rotting leaves and forest debris. Vines had grown through the windows and up through cracks in the floor, creating an almost jungle-like tangle. But despite the decay and overgrowth, the building's original purpose was unmistakably, horribly clear. Along both long walls were the rusted remnants of iron bed frames, bolted directly into the floor. Not regular beds, but something more like examination tables or restraint platforms. Heavy iron rings were still attached to the frames, positioned where wrists and ankles would have been secured. There were 6 such frames visible in the section of the building that remained partially intact. Sarah photographed everything, her hands shaking so badly that she had to brace her camera against the wall to keep the images from blurring. She moved deeper into the ruined structure, her feet crunching on broken glass and unidentifiable debris. In what had been a smaller back room, partially separated from the main space by a collapsed interior wall, she found more evidence of the building's true nature. Shelving units, now tilted at crazy angles, still held the remains of bottles and jars, their contents long since evaporated or congealed into unidentifiable residues. Rusted medical instruments were scattered across what had been a work surface, scalpels, forceps, saws, and other implements whose exact purposes Sarah didn't want to contemplate. Most disturbingly, she found syringes, dozens of them, many still fitted with long, cruel-looking needles. In one corner, a metal filing cabinet had somehow remained partially upright, despite the building's decay. It was rusted nearly shut, its drawers jammed. Sarah used her crowbar, straining and prying for almost 45 minutes before finally forcing the top drawer open with a shriek of protesting metal. Inside were ledgers, account books with marbled covers, their pages water-stained and degraded, but still largely legible. Sarah carefully extracted the books and sat on a relatively stable section of floor in the light from the doorway. Her hands trembled as she opened the first ledger and began to read. The entries were written in a precise, educated hand. The handwriting was neat, controlled, utterly clinical in tone. They documented medical experiments conducted on human subjects over a period of several months in late 1895 and early 1896. The subjects were identified not by name, but only by numbers. Subject 7 through Subject 14, Sarah read with mounting horror and revulsion. The experiment systematically tested human responses to various forms of suffering. Pain tolerance was measured through the application of increasingly severe stimuli, heat, cold, pressure, cutting, chemical irritants. Psychological responses were documented, effects of prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, exposure to disturbing images and sounds. The physical limits of young bodies were explored through starvation, dehydration, exposure to temperature extremes, forced physical exertion beyond the point of collapse. Each entry was coldly scientific, devoid of any recognition that the subjects were human beings, were children. Results were recorded with meticulous precision, measurements taken, observations noted in clinical terminology. When subjects failed to survive particular experiments, this was noted with a simple mark in the margin and a brief comment. Subject 8 expired 14 to 23 hours. Respiratory failure. Subject 11 expired 0347 hours. Cardiac arrest. Subject 10 expired 1156 hours. Shock and blood loss. The later entries included notes about specimen preservation for further anatomical study, and references to interment in East Field, unmarked, depth approximately 4 feet. Sarah felt bile rising in her throat. She forced herself to keep reading, to document everything. The dates aligned perfectly with the missing persons report she'd found. Subject 12, first entry dated October 12th. 1895, the same day Daniel Hartley was last seen. Subject 13, admitted October 18th, the day Michael O'Brien vanished. The correlations continued through all 7 disappearances. Daniel Hartley, according to these horrifying records, had survived as Subject 12 for 23 days, longer than any of the others. The entries about him were particularly detailed, noting his remarkable resilience and exceptional pain tolerance for his age and constitution. The final entry, dated November 4th, 1895, read in that same cold, clinical tone. Subject 12 expired at 4:13 hours following complete cardiac failure after sustained procedure. Specimen showed remarkable durability throughout all testing phases. Final results exceed expectations. Anatomical preservation completed. Interment East Field, Section C unmarked. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she read her phone. She photographed every page of every ledger, her horror and rage building with each documented atrocity. At the bottom of the filing cabinet, in the lowest drawer which took another 20 minutes to force open, she found something even more damning. A journal, more personal than the clinical ledgers. This was written in the same hand, but with a different tone, less rigidly formal. Dr. Jacob Hartley's private notes on his research. In these pages, he revealed his true motivations and the full extent of his monstrous philosophy. He wrote extensively about his belief that medical science could only advance through unfettered experimentation on living subjects. He argued that the ethical restrictions placed on medical research by squeamish authorities and sentimental moralists were holding back human progress. He believed that society's most vulnerable members, the poor, the young, those without power or social standing, should be seen as resources for advancing medical knowledge that would ultimately benefit their social superiors. He documented his careful selection criteria for subjects. He wanted children specifically, believing their bodies would provide purer data without the complications of adult vices, like alcohol or tobacco use. He selected from populations that lacked social power to resist or seek justice: poor white tenant farmers' children, black workers' children, recent immigrants' children, people who, if they disappeared, wouldn't spark extensive investigations or powerful demands for accountability. Most chillingly, he wrote about including his own youngest son in the experiments. The entry was dated October 10th, 1895, 2 days before Daniel Hartley was listed as admitted as Subject 12. Hartley wrote, "Daniel has unfortunately discovered the nature of the research being conducted in the medical facility. Rather than risk exposure of this vital work, I have concluded that he too must serve the cause of scientific advancement. His youth and health make him an ideal subject, and using him will eliminate the security risk he represents, while also demonstrating my complete dedication to scientific objectivity. Family sentiment cannot be allowed to impede the march of human knowledge." Sarah sat in that ruined, evil place and wept. She wept for Daniel Hartley, betrayed by the father who should have protected him. She wept for Michael O'Brien and Samuel Washington and Robert Lee and Thomas Brooks and James Patterson and William Hayes. Children who had disappeared into this building and experienced unimaginable suffering before dying alone and terrified. She wept for the families who had searched for their lost children and never received answers. She wept for the brothers in that photograph who had known, or at least suspected, what their father was doing and had remained silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty or the crushing weight of patriarchal authority. She called Marcus first, then she called the Charleston Police Department. Within 3 hours, the site was crawling with police, forensic specialists, and archaeologists. Ground-penetrating radar identified numerous anomalies in the designated East Field area, locations where the soil density and composition suggested graves or disturbed earth. The excavation began 2 days later, proceeding with painstaking archaeological care. Sarah watched from the perimeter, unable to tear herself away, even though witnessing the exhumation was agonizing. They found the first set of remains on the second day of digging, a child's skeleton, buried in a shallow grave without any coffin or shroud, just wrapped in what appeared to be medical gauze that had mostly decomposed. The forensic anthropologist carefully examined the bones on site, estimating the individual's age at death as between 12 and 14 years old. Over the next 2 weeks, they found 6 more sets of human remains, all children, all buried without any dignity or ceremony. The bones showed signs of trauma, healed fractures that had never been properly set, marks consistent with cutting or sawing, evidence of repeated injury. The forensic examinations painted a picture of prolonged suffering before death. DNA technology couldn't help identify these specific remains. The technology for extracting and analyzing DNA from bones, this old, was still developing and wasn't reliable for remains from this time period. But Sarah worked with historians, genealogists, and old medical records to make probable identifications based on age, sex, the dates in Hartley's ledgers, and the documented disappearances. Subject 12, buried in Section C of the East Field. Almost certainly Daniel Hartley, age 14. Subject 13, probably Michael O'Brien, age 13. Subject 14, likely Samuel Washington, age 15, and so on through the terrible list. The story broke nationally within days. Charleston plantation concealed child experimentation and murder site read the headlines across major newspapers. Television news covered it extensively. The Historical Society released the photograph, the ledgers, the journal, all of Sarah's meticulously documented research. The public response was immediate, overwhelming, and intensely emotional. Anger at the atrocities that had been committed, grief for the young victims, shock that such horrors could have occurred and been covered up for more than a century. The descendants of some of the victims' families came forward. A great-great-grandniece of Michael O'Brien traveled from Boston. Several descendants of the black families whose children had been taken spoke publicly about the multi-generational trauma of never knowing what had happened to their young relatives, of the whispered family stories about children who had disappeared near the Hartley plantation, stories that had been dismissed or ignored by white authorities. But through all of this, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the photograph, about the faceless figure, about why someone, almost certainly one of the surviving Hartley brothers, had deliberately destroyed Jacob Hartley's image while preserving the photograph itself. She went back to the historical records, diving even deeper into the scattered traces the brothers had left behind. In a Baltimore archive, Among a collection of documents donated by a historical society from a now defunct church, she finally found what she'd been searching for. A letter, written in 1920, discovered among the personal effects of James Hartley after his death. The letter had apparently been written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular. Perhaps it was never meant to be sent. Perhaps it was a confession, an unburdening of a terrible secret that James had carried for 25 years. The letter was several pages long, written in increasingly shaky handwriting that suggested the writer was either ill, elderly, or drinking heavily while writing. Probably all three, Sarah thought, given what she knew about James Hartley's final years. She read it in the archive's reading room, fresh tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the anguish pouring from the page. James wrote about the summer of 1895, about that photograph taken on the porch of Magnolia Grove, about how their father had insisted on being in the image, had positioned himself among his sons with his hand on Daniel's shoulder, a gesture of ownership, James called it, a visible claim of paternal authority and dominion over his children. He wrote about the medical facility, about how they had all known something terrible was happening there, about the screams they sometimes heard late at night when the windows were open, about the boys from local families who came to the facility and never left, about their father's lectures on the necessity of scientific progress, on how some must suffer so that others might benefit, on the greater good that justified individual sacrifice. James described how they had been terrified of their father, how Dr. Jacob Hartley ruled his household with absolute authority, brooking no questioning of his decisions or actions, how he justified everything in the name of medical advancement and scientific knowledge, how he convinced his sons, or at least convinced them to remain silent, by invoking duty and loyalty and the family's reputation and position in Charleston society. Then he wrote about Daniel, about how their youngest brother, at 14 years old, had been braver than any of them, how Daniel had finally declared that he was going to tell the police what was happening in the medical facility, that the screams had to stop, that someone had to speak up for the missing boys, how their father had responded. I will never forget the look in Father's eyes when Daniel said he would go to the authorities, James had written in that shaking hand. It was cold, calculating, utterly devoid of any paternal feeling. Within 2 days, Daniel was gone. Father told us he had run away, but we all knew the truth. We had seen Daniel's expression of terror in the family photograph just months before, when Father's hand had rested on his shoulder. We knew Daniel had become just another subject in Father's experiments, just another sacrifice on the altar of what Father called scientific progress. And we did nothing. We said nothing. We were cowards, every one of us. The letter went on to describe how the burden of this knowledge, this complicity, had destroyed them all. Thomas, the eldest, had become increasingly despondent and reckless, ultimately walking into the Ashley River one night and not walking back out. William had been consumed by guilt and horror until his mind simply broke under the weight of what he knew and what he'd failed to prevent. James and Robert had fled Charleston, trying to escape the memories, but carrying their guilt with them wherever they went. James wrote about the photograph, about how in 1898, 3 years after it was taken, he had found it among their father's possessions after the old man's death. Jacob Hartley had died at age 50, his death certificate listing stroke as the cause, though James suspected the real cause was syphilis contracted from his frequent visits to Charleston's brothels. I tried to destroy the photograph entirely, James wrote. I wanted to burn it, to erase all evidence of that terrible summer, of our family's shame. But I couldn't bring myself to do it completely because it was the last image of Daniel, the last proof he had existed. So I took acid and carefully burned away Father's face. I wanted his image erased from our family history. I wanted him unmade, forgotten as if he had never existed. But even in defacing his image, I kept the photograph itself as a confession of what we allowed to happen, as evidence for anyone who might someday look closely enough to see the truth. We were given every advantage in life, the letter continued. Education, social position, wealth, authority. And we used these advantages to hide terrible crimes, to protect a monster because he was our father, and we convinced ourselves that family loyalty mattered more than justice or mercy, or the lives of children who had no power to defend themselves. We told ourselves we were helpless, that we had no choice but to obey, that it wasn't our responsibility, we were wrong, we were complicit. We enabled evil to flourish because speaking against it would have cost us comfort and social standing. The letter ended with a statement that Sarah felt in her soul. I deserve no forgiveness, seek no absolution. I write this not to be remembered kindly, but to ensure that the truth is preserved somewhere, even if I am too cowardly to speak it while alive. 7 boys died because one man believed himself above morality and law, and because his sons lacked the courage to stop him. Those boys deserve justice. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their names spoken aloud after decades of forced silence. If anyone ever finds this letter, find those boys. Give them proper burial. Tell the world what happened to them. Make sure no one forgets. That is my only hope for redemption. That someday, somehow, the truth comes to light. Sarah sat in the archive reading room for a long time after finishing the letter, thinking about courage and complicity, about authority and resistance, about what happens when people choose comfortable silence over costly speech. James Hartley had written his confession, but hadn't had the strength to make it public while he lived. It had taken more than a century, a damaged photograph, and Sarah's persistent investigation to finally give voice to his anguished admission of guilt. The memorial service was held 6 months later on a warm March morning. The former Eastfield of Magnolia Grove plantation had been transformed. Where shallow graves had held children's bodies in unmarked secrecy for over a century, there now stood 7 small headstones of polished granite, arranged in a circle with a larger central monument. Each individual stone was engraved with a name, birth year, and the date they had disappeared. The central monument bore an inscription, "In memory of 7 children lost to human evil." May their suffering never be forgotten. May their courage inspire us to speak against authority when authority demands injustice. Daniel Hartley, Michael O'Brien, Samuel Washington, Robert Lee, Thomas Brooks, James Patterson, William Hayes. More than 300 people attended the dedication ceremony, descendants of the victims' families, members of Charleston's black community, for whom these deaths represented part of a larger history of racist violence and exploitation, historians and activists and ordinary citizens who had been moved by the story. News cameras documented everything. This wasn't just a local memorial service. It had become a national moment of reckoning with uncomfortable truths about American history. Sarah gave the main speech. She had worked on it for weeks, trying to find the right words to honor the dead, to educate the living, to draw meaningful connections between past atrocities and present responsibilities. She talked about how Dr. Jacob Hartley had used every advantage he possessed, his education, his professional authority, his position in society, his power as a father, to commit unconscionable crimes against vulnerable children. She talked about how an entire community had failed these boys by accepting easy explanations for their disappearances, by not demanding accountability from powerful people, by prioritizing social order over protecting the powerless. These boys were denied their most fundamental freedoms, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the quiet gathering. Their freedom to live, their freedom to grow up, their freedom to choose their own futures. They were treated as property, as experimental subjects, as things to be used rather than human beings with inherent dignity and rights. We gather here today not merely to remember what was done to them, but to commit ourselves to vigilance, to questioning authority when it demands blind obedience, to protecting the vulnerable when institutions fail them, to speaking up when others would prefer our silence. She talked about the Hartley brothers, about their choice to remain silent, about how their complicity had poisoned the remainder of their lives. They were victims too, in a sense, Sarah acknowledged, victims of a system that taught them unquestioning obedience to paternal authority was virtue, that family reputation mattered more than individual conscience, that maintaining social order justified terrible sacrifices. But they were also perpetrators. They knew what their father was doing, or strongly suspected it, and they chose silence. They chose their own comfort and security over the lives of children who depended on someone, anyone, speaking up for them. She held up a reproduction of the photograph, enlarged so that everyone in attendance could see it. The 5 brothers, young and doomed, the faceless void where their father had stood. James Hartley tried to erase his father's face from this photograph, tried to literally unmake him from the family image. But the erasure itself became evidence. The blank space testified to what had been hidden. It drew attention rather than deflecting it. And more than a century later, it led to the discovery of the truth. Sarah pointed to the headstones arranged behind her. These boys are no longer nameless and forgotten. They are no longer buried in secret shame. Their deaths have been acknowledged. Their suffering has been documented. Their names will be remembered. And their tragedy teaches us that freedom means nothing if we don't have the courage to defend it for everyone, especially for those who have the least power to defend themselves. After the formal ceremony concluded, many people approached Sarah personally. Some thanked her for her investigation and dedication. Others shared their own family stories of marginalized relatives who had disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances and been forgotten by history. One elderly woman who introduced herself as Juanita Washington, a distant relation to Samuel Washington, stood before the headstone bearing her ancestor's name and wept quietly. "My grandmother told me stories," Juanita said softly to Sarah, "about her little brother who disappeared when he was just a boy. She said the white doctor on the plantation had taken him and he never came back. But when she tried to tell people, tried to get the police to investigate, they told her she was lying, that her brother probably just ran away. She carried that pain her whole life, knowing her brother had been taken and murdered, but being unable to prove it or get justice for him. I wish she could have lived to see this day, to see his name on this stone, to know that someone finally believed her and finally told the truth." That conversation, more than any of the news coverage or public recognition, made Sarah understand the full importance of what she had uncovered. This wasn't just historical curiosity or academic research. It was about giving voice to people who had been silenced, about honoring suffering that had been deliberately hidden, about insisting that every life mattered enough to be remembered and mourned, regardless of race or social class or power. The photograph of the Hartley brothers and their faceless father went on permanent display in the Charleston Historical Society, housed in a climate-controlled case with extensive interpretive materials explaining its history and significance. School groups came to see it. History classes incorporated it into lessons about scientific ethics, human rights, and the importance of questioning authority. Criminology courses used the case study to examine how social power structures can enable and conceal serious crimes. But Sarah never stopped thinking about those 7 boys, about the 3 months of horror they had experienced in that isolated building at Magnolia Grove. about the fact that their suffering could have been prevented if anyone with knowledge or power had chosen to act. She thought about the delicate balance between obedience and independence, between trust in authority and healthy skepticism, between maintaining social order and protecting individual rights. She returned to the Historical Society's archives with renewed purpose. If 7 boys could disappear from one Charleston plantation with barely a ripple of public concern, how many other stories lay hidden in those boxes and folders? How many other victims waited to be found and named? How many other uncomfortable truths about Charleston's past, and by extension about American history more broadly, remained buried because acknowledging them would require confronting painful realities about power, privilege, racism, and exploitation? Sarah began a new project, documenting disappearances of black residents from Charleston during the Jim Crow era, cases where young men and women had vanished and received minimal investigation because of the color of their skin. She found dozens of cases, then hundreds. Each one represented a person whose life had mattered, whose loss had grieved families, whose absence had left scars that lasted for generations. Marcus joined her in this work, bringing his own knowledge of Charleston's black history and community connections that helped them find sources and stories that might otherwise have remained hidden. Together, they built an archive of the forgotten, a growing collection of names and faces and stories that challenged the comfortable narratives Charleston told about itself. The photograph remained at the center of this ongoing work, a constant reminder of what could be discovered when someone looked closely enough, questioned deeply enough, refused to accept easy answers or comfortable silence. The faceless figure in that image, the deliberate erasure that had paradoxically preserved the truth, became a symbol, not just of Dr. Jacob Hartley's monstrous crimes, but of the broader pattern of powerful people committing atrocities and less powerful people paying the price, while still others who witnessed or suspected chose silence over the risky, costly work of speaking truth to authority. 10 years after Sarah first found the photograph, Charleston erected a permanent exhibition at the site of the former Magnolia Grove plantation. The exhibition included the restored medical facility building, stabilized and preserved as a memorial site. Visitors could walk through the building where the experiments had occurred, could see the rusted bed frames with their restraints, could read extensive interpretive panels explaining in unflinching detail what had happened there and why it had been allowed to happen. The exhibition didn't shy away from difficult questions. It explicitly discussed Charleston's history of enslaving people, of exploiting black labor during and after slavery, of creating and maintaining social hierarchies that valued some lives over others. It connected Dr. Hartley's crimes to broader patterns of medical experimentation on marginalized people. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments, forced sterilizations, unethical research on prisoners and institutionalized individuals, the taking of Henrietta Lack's cells without consent, and it asked visitors to think about the present. How does unchecked authority operate in our own time? Who are the vulnerable people in our communities? What would we do if we suspected that people in power were harming those without power? Would we speak up? Would we investigate? Would we risk our own comfort and security to protect others? Or would we, like the Hartley brothers, choose silence and live with the consequences of that choice? The memorial to the 7 boys became a site of pilgrimage for some, a place of reflection and commitment. People left flowers at the headstones. They left notes of remembrance. Some left pledges to honor the boys' memory by standing up against injustice in their own lives and communities. Sarah visited regularly, often bringing students and researchers who were continuing the work of uncovering hidden histories. She would stand before those 7 headstones and think about the faces she'd seen in old family photographs, young faces full of life and potential, cut off before they had a chance to become who they might have been. She thought about their final days and hours. The terror and pain they must have experienced, the desperate hope that someone would save them that must have slowly died as no help came. And she thought about freedom. Real freedom, not just the absence of literal chains, but the presence of protection. The assurance that society valued your life enough to defend it, that your voice mattered enough to be heard, that your suffering would be acknowledged and addressed rather than dismissed or hidden. The boys buried here had been denied that freedom by a man who saw them as experimental subjects rather than human beings, by a community that didn't value their lives enough to investigate their disappearances thoroughly, by a legal and social system that made some people effectively disposable. That kind of freedom, Sarah understood, had to be constantly defended and re-earned in every generation. It wasn't guaranteed by constitutions or declarations. It required ordinary people being willing to question, to investigate, to speak up even when silence was easier and safer. It required looking at photographs and asking uncomfortable questions instead of accepting easy explanations. It required remembering instead of forgetting, confronting instead of burying, honoring uncomfortable truths instead of preserving comfortable lies. The photograph of the Hartley brothers, with its faceless figure standing among them, would continue to ask those questions of everyone who looked at it. And the 7 headstones in the former East Field would continue to bear witness to what happened when those questions went unasked for too long, when authority went unchallenged, when the powerful were allowed to operate in darkness, while the powerless suffered and died in silence. Sarah hoped, with a hope she wasn't entirely sure was justified, that future generations would look at that photograph and those graves and choose differently, that they would choose courage over comfort, speech over silence, protection of the vulnerable over preservation of the powerful. That the boys who died at Magnolia Grove would not have died entirely in vain if their deaths taught others to be vigilant, to question, to speak, to resist. The faceless brother finally had a name. The buried boys finally had proper graves and lasting memorials. And Charleston, confronting one of its darkest chapters, had been forced to reckon with uncomfortable truths about complicity, courage, and what it truly meant to value freedom and human dignity. The work would continue, the conversations would go on, the process of uncovering hidden histories would persist. But for 7 children who had suffered and died in darkness and secrecy more than a century ago, there was at least this: light, acknowledgement, remembrance, and the promise that their names would be spoken and their suffering would not be forgotten as long as people committed to truth and justice remained willing to look closely, question deeply, and speak clearly about even the most uncomfortable aspects of the past.